Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Co-ops Building a Better World with me, Rebecca Harvey, the editor of Co-op News, and my colleague, Professor Colin Talbot.
Hello, everyone.
How are you doing, Colin?
I'm all right, thank you. It's actually sunny and warm.
Makes it, it makes a change, doesn't it? It's getting pretty
Yes.
warm here. And I think that's an interesting segue actually into our first topic of discussion. So we're going to talk about two things today. First of all, we're going to be talking about agriculture and what's going on in that sector of the co-op movement. And then we're going to talk a little bit about Andy Burnham's recent victory in the Makerfield by-election in the UK. And this is quite an interesting one, not just for people in the UK, but internationally, because it talks to how different parts of the political spectrum can potentially work together to help build a better world through cooperation. Does that sound like a plan, Colin?
It does. And for those of you who don't know, it looks fairly likely that Andy Burnham's actually going to be the next British Prime Minister. So it's worth finding out about him.
It certainly is. Well, let's start with agriculture first of all, because our May edition of Co-op News had quite a few stories on agriculture. Agriculture is a huge part of the co-op movement worldwide, and some of the world's largest cooperatives are in the agricultural sector. A lot of them are the huge dairy co-ops in New Zealand, Australia, India, people like Fonterra, Amul, quite a lot of big dairy co-ops. And of course, the agricultural sector is also being impacted about what's going on in Iran. Now, we keep hearing about peace talks. Hopefully, fertilizer and fuel will soon be passing through the Straits of Hormuz. But for now, there are still quite a lot of pressure on the agricultural sector, including agricultural co-ops, about how this is still going to impact organisations going forward. One of the organisations that is really sounding the alarm for all agricultural co-ops is COGECA, which is the General Confederation of Agricultural Co-ops in Europe. Now, this organisation was founded in the late 1950s, and they act as one of the most influential interest groups for European agri-food and forestry and fishery co-ops to EU institutions. And the president, Lennart Nilsson, he himself is part of an agricultural co-op in Sweden, and they are seriously concerned for their members. And he described what's going on in the Straits of Hormuz as maybe one of the toughest crises that the farming sector has met with. And this situation is forcing farmers to make really difficult decisions, such as whether to choose to farm with lower intensity or farm half the acreage as usual and setting the rest aside. So it's a really tricky situation, isn't it, Colin?
Yeah, and it's come for most farmers at the worst time of year, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere. At the beginning of summer, it's people planting late crops for the summer period and also winter crops for Christmas. And so it's a really difficult period.
It's interesting as well, actually, because it's come at a time when there's been quite a lot of talk in the political level about agricultural crops and how can contribute to food security. And last month, the UK Co-op Party, with support from the Co-op Group, actually issued a report all around how farm co-ops can boost the UK's food security, and it talks about how co-ops in particular can enable farmers to pool resources, share risk, invest collectively, and by doing so, reduce exposure to volatile input markets, strengthen bargaining power, and actually work better together to create a more viable and consistent food chain.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm talking to Paul Gosling later on this broadcast, who's got an article on agri co-ops in this issue of the magazine. Um, One of the things we talked about is the fact that we've seen a really interesting trend in agricultural co-ops, which started off as small, in most countries, started off as small local cooperatives for the late 19th century and first half of the 20th century. And then after the Second World War, there's been a long, slow trend towards agglomeration of cooperatives growing into bigger and bigger national bodies in most countries. Some of that's accelerated recently because of some of the climate change challenges that are happening, and I suspect this current crisis in the Gulf of Hormuz will actually accelerate that trend quite considerably. And one of the things Paul and I talk about is the fact that there are positives and negatives about having much larger cooperatives. The ones that they get sold on are around resilience and efficiency and so on. but there are also negative consequences about members of cooperatives not feeling as engaged and feeling that the management's more remote from them.
Okay, well, so we'll come back to your conversation with Paul shortly, Colin. But one thing I wanted to talk about in terms of huge agricultural organisations is the idea around regenerative agriculture. And one of the articles we did in the May edition was all around an organisation called SAI platform, which is an association headquartered in Switzerland that brings together a huge number of some of the world's largest agricultural organisations together to talk about um, how to really embed regenerative agriculture into global practices. And what's super interesting about this organization it is that it's got nearly 200 members, and over 20 of those are agricultural co-ops. So really big names like Arla, Lakeland Dairies, Fonterra, and you've got Land O'Lakes and Ocean Spray from the US too, alongside huge global brands like Diageo, Carlsberg, Friesland Campina, Mondelez, some of these really, really big names. And I think what was fascinating about talking to them was how it's a bit like how when we spoke to the European Confederation of Energy Co-ops in the context of what's going on with Iran and how this is an opportunity, like a crisis is an opportunity. Obviously, what's going on is awful, but this is an opportunity for change. Similarly, regenerative agriculture is coming out of this situation in Iran because, one of the key practices of it is using natural fertilizers instead of synthetic inputs. And yeah, everybody in the food and beverage industry is aware that farmers are seeing fertilizers pricing going up. So this is quite an interesting conversation to have.
Yeah, I mean, just on a personal note, I'm old enough to have grown up. I partly grew up on a farm in Kent, and in the late 1950s, early 60s, I spent a lot of time as unpaid child labour for my my father's mate who ran the farm. And one of the things that's obviously striking about that is that back in the late 1950s, early 1960s, things like mechanization, like artificial fertilizers, were far less prominent. I mean, I don't remember us using them at all on the farm that we grew up on. Um, we're sort of cycling back towards, I think, a more natural form of farming than we have in the last 4 or 5, well, slightly longer decades.
That is super interesting. I think with regenerative agriculture, one of the criticisms is that it's a greenwashing label for the meat industry in particular, partly because there's no real clear and globally recognized legal standard or
Right.
legal definition. I think this is something that Side Platform is trying to work on, especially bringing in the agricultural cooperatives. And it sounds like that new framework that they're developing was actually led by its members in particular who asked for real definition about what regenerative agriculture is because they didn't want to fall into the trap of greenwashing. So it's going to be super interesting to see what comes out of that.
Yeah,
Really
and there's some
interesting.
very complicated issues around it. I mean, for example, the movement towards allowing animals free range to grow, things like pigs and chickens being out in fields rather than in warehouses, uh, potentially has unintended consequences. So places like where I used to live on the Wye Valley down in Wales, there's been a major pollution problem which has been created by free range, mainly free range chicken farms, where the muck's washing off and into the rivers and causing major pollution issues. So it's a very, very complicated system, and coming up with standards which prevent those sort of unintended consequences is actually quite tricky.
It's hugely complicated, isn't it? But going from really big agricultural organizations to smaller ones, we also ran an article all about how in Guatemala there's been quite a lot of collective responses to common challenges by supporting very small scale agricultural producers. And there's a fantastic organization called it's this I'm not going to read out the Spanish because my Spanish today is not great, but it's this Association for Agricultural and Micro Enterprise Development, which was established in the late 90s to improve the living conditions of particularly vulnerable indigenous populations in areas of Guatemala. Because Guatemala is fascinating actually because it's one of the very few, I think it's the only Central American country where an indigenous culture constitutes the majority of the population. So over 50% of Guatemalans are from Mayan communities. And what this organization does is very much work with grassroots organizations, including co-ops made up entirely of indigenous women who are organized into groups of between about 20 and 50 members working in agriculture across different municipalities in Quetzaltenango, which is in the western part of Guatemala. So they support women working in agriculture at obviously a much smaller scale than people like Sci Platform or some of these large agricultural co-ops. But I guess for me, Colin, it's really indicative of how wide-ranging the co-op sectors can be within specific topics.
Yeah, and can fit different types of tasks and working environments very differently depending on, exactly what it is. I think there's some interesting research on how uh, forms of organization can be very task specific, and in things like where you've got localized agricultural production, then having localized small cooperatives probably makes a huge amount of sense.
It really does. And talking of localization, I can tell you what, we'll talk about Andy Burnham shortly because he does quite a lot of interesting things around decentralization and localization and mutualism. But before we do that, let's bring in your conversation with Paul Gosling, Colin. So for some of you may know the name Paul Gosling. Paul's written for Co-op News for many, many years. And he wrote a book actually on what happened with the Co-op Bank about 10 years ago or so. And you spoke to him, Colin. So let's bring in that interview
I
now.
did. It's nice to see and talk to Paul Gosling again, who I worked with when I was at the University of Manchester a number of times. And Paul was doing some freelance work for us. So, hi, Paul. How are you?
Hi, Colin. Good to meet up again. Really good to see you. And yeah, I'm fine.
Good. Paul's got an article in the latest issue of Cooperative News about Irish agri co-ops. Um, but we've also been discussing, and he sent me some interesting stuff on wider developments in the agricultural sector generally, and also some of the issues around agricultural co-ops. And his article in the magazine talks about agricultural co-ops in Ireland, but also in the UK. So if we start off by just looking at the big picture around agriculture in Britain and Ireland, Paul, I think that would be quite useful.
Yeah, and of course, it's also in the sense of the Brexit anniversary 10 years on, which was
Right.
predicted to really deconstruct a lot of the agricultural sector in Ireland because of the perception, the expectation of the border breaking up a lot of the cooperative organisation within Ireland. So it's interesting to reflect 10 years on that actually the stuff that was expected to go wrong actually hasn't gone wrong because of the arrangements around Brexit. But clearly, despite that, the agricultural sector across the whole of the UK and even in Ireland is facing challenging times at the moment.
Yeah, maybe you could say something a bit more about that, about the sort of global picture, because it's not just affecting British and Irish agriculture, obviously.
No, that's right. I mean, generally, there's a lot of pressure in terms of the cost of living and the demand on supermarkets and on food processors to push food prices down. Despite that, it has to be said, Tesco recorded consistently £2 billion annual profits, pre-tax profits. So, they're not struggling, but it's the consumers that are struggling. And what the supermarket chains and the food processors are doing is pushing farmers to supply at very low costs. And actually, in many cases, they're actually supplying it below the cost of production. And that's causing real difficulties for farmers, also for farming co-ops. But, consistently, for example, in dairy, production costs are around 35 pence a litre, and 40 to 50 pence per litre, but actually they're being paid by the supermarket chains around 35 pence per litre and the food processors. So there's a significant pressure on food producers in terms of the fact that they're not getting proper repayment for their efforts.
Yeah, and obviously your article's mainly about the trend towards mergers in cooperatives in the Irish Republic, but that's part of a general international trend that's been going on since the Second World War.
Yeah, and I noticed that one of the recent combinations of co-ops in Ireland was saying, very happily they're achieving 7 million euro per year cost savings, but that's actually only 1% of their turnover. And so you're seeing mergers driven by what, in percentage terms, is very small reductions in overheads. So you've got quite significant structural change driven by very small percentage improvements in consolidated costs. So, you can see, I think that reflects the pressures you have. And of course, what's significant for agricultural cooperatives is a lot of these were historically very geographically specific. Some of them would have been based around the individual villages, not just towns or provinces, So you're seeing this significant change across the whole of the island of Ireland. And in a sense, that is changing the relationship of the individual farmers with the cooperatives that they're supplying to. Certain stresses, because some of the farmers are not feeling that they're sufficiently close to the new larger co-ops. So you can see trends that perhaps reflect a lot of what's going on more globally across all sectors of cooperatives, where there's this division between the historic connection with the cooperative and what's happening now because of those, global corporate pressures.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. The I've been reading some academic research on the sort of global trends in agricultural co-ops, and I mean this is a sweeping generalization, but at the end of the 19th century and for the first half of the 20th century, the number of cooperatives expanded hugely, but they were, as you say, mostly quite small and quite local. And people in the co-ops knew each other fairly well. And this applies not just to the British and Irish Isles, but it was the case in the United States and India and various other places. What's happened since the Second World War is that there's been a slow process of consolidation of cooperatives into much larger bodies. And one of the issues, as you say, is then that raises the issue about how far members of the cooperative can meaningfully engage in their management and structures. Uh, One of the suggestions is that the more that large co-ops form and become more distant from the members, the more they become like investor-owned businesses in the sense that they've got a distant management structure, which and governance structure, which is it's hard to engage with. I mean, is there evidence of that in the Irish Republic? And
Absolutely. Both North and South, I think the nature of that relationship has changed. And what we're seeing is while farmers are still providing milk supplies, particularly a lot of what we're talking about is about the dairy sector. So they're still supplying milk into the cooperatives. But the relationship, while on the one hand is as suppliers to a cooperative that they're part owners to, really, for many cases, the relationship is as an equity owner. And so you're seeing that the management is focused on returns. It doesn't necessarily, some farmers would say, reflect the best interests of the farming members. And what it's very focused on is returns, financial returns, and in some cases, perhaps their own director returns as well. And the interest in some of those cases for the farmers is as equity owners, and they're not necessarily committed to the cooperatives as cooperatives, but as a
right.
vehicle for investment and financial return. And of course, that's more the case because they are being squeezed financially in terms of their returns on their production. So if they're getting an investment return as equity investors, then actually that perhaps eases their situation a bit.
Yeah. Is that I mean the British government, the new Labour government, 'cause it came in supposedly committed to doubling the size of the cooperative and mutual sector, and it's not clear yet exactly how that's going to impact on the agricultural sector in Britain. Is there anything similar in the Irish Republic?
Um, well, the relationship between the cooperative movement and the sector body in the Republic has been criticised.
Right.
There is a sense that perhaps it's lost its way a bit in terms of cooperative principles. And I think the comparison there in terms of Britain would be the way so many of the building societies demutualised. And you have that, concept of what is the equity return? What equity return do I get? And you can see that if the value of cooperative principle and engagement is lost, then that focused on your role as an equity investor becomes much more important. And that I think is behind what happened with the building societies. Excuse me. And that's also, I think, been what's helped reshape things within Ireland. And I suppose, Colin, the other question around that is if you're talking about doubling the size of the cooperative sector, are you focused on turnover or are you focused in numbers? Are you focused on profitability, the nature of the engagement? And those are perhaps, fairly profound policy questions that I doubt whether the government has got to grips with.
No, I mean, there's some obvious examples. If you merge lots of cooperatives in order to provide more mutual services, like, for example, farm machinery and so on, you're actually likely to reduce the workforce um, as you replace workers with more technology. Um,
And of course, Colin, it's a particular issue, I think, for credit unions because you're seeing, quite a lot of credit unions have closed. A lot of what credit unions have done is very profitable and very effective. But the way to do that, again, is to consolidate, and then you're losing that intimate connectivity with a lot of your members. So the credit union movement, I think, is also facing a lot of the same challenges that we've seen in the agricultural co-op sector, building society sector, and so on.
Yeah, one of the things I found interesting, and we're going to be pursuing on this podcast and in Cooperative News magazine, is Principle 2 of the ICA principles about democratic control, because I think right across the board, not just in agriculture, but where you've had consolidation of co-ops into much larger bodies, it does pose questions about how they can be effectively democratically controlled. Uh, One of the things I'm interested in is that there have been lots of innovations in democratic control for government and state-owned bodies and state provision, but quite a few of those innovations have not transferred over into the cooperative sector, where they'd actually probably be quite useful.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's also important to reflect on the quality of leadership and the connectivity of the leadership with cooperative principles and values. I can tell you a story. I mean, I've been writing for Co-op News now for more than 40 years, I think. And I was a CDA worker before I became a journalist. And in the history of my engagement with Co-op News, there was one particular agricultural co-op that I would be writing about quite regularly for the Belfast Telegraph. And every time I wrote the article for the Belfast Telegraph, I'd phone up the chief executive of that agricultural co-op and they would speak to me. Whenever I contacted him on behalf of Co-op News, he would never speak to me. And I think that reflects the lack of connectivity of some of the leadership of the co-op sector with the historic principles and values of the sector.
Yeah, there's a very funny story at the beginning of Johnson Birchall's book about investor-owned, member-owned businesses, about being at a meeting in the UK Treasury, and somebody who was the chief executive of a mutual not understanding that it actually wasn't mutual because this guy had been brought in from the private sector.
Yes.
It's not unusual. I've experienced similar things in the civil service and public services. Anyway, we'll have to wrap up there. Thanks very much for joining us, Paul. It's been really great to talk to you again.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Colin.
If you're enjoying this podcast, why not consider becoming a member of Co-op News? As well as writing and talking about co-ops, we are a multi-stakeholder cooperative ourselves. For individual membership, visit thenews.coop/membership. Or if your organisation would like to become a direct member, email membership@thenews.coop to find out more about joining the heart of the co-op conversation.
Okay, so we're going to turn to talking about Andy Burnham. Why are we talking about an obscure new MP in a local constituency? He's just been elected in a by-election in the UK. Well, first of all, he's been for the last decade the mayor of Greater Manchester, which is one of the biggest conurbations in the UK. And the likelihood is he's going to be our next Prime Minister. So he's a fairly important character. And he's got a long history of association with the cooperative movement.
He
Rebecca,
has, yeah.
you're about to write about that.
We are, yes. We've been busily putting an article together. So by the time this podcast goes live, the article will be up. I'll be able to read all about it. So as a reminder, Andy Burnham stood under the Labour and Co-operative banner. So for a very long time, over 100 years now, the Co-op Party has never been able to stand candidates under the Co-op Party, but it's got a sister relationship with the Labour Party. So there's a number of MPs who stand under the Labour and Co-operative banner. But actually, there's only ever been one MP who actually was an active Labour and Co-operative member, and that was just trying to find his name. It was Ramsay MacDonald in 1923, and he also was the Labour Co-op MP between 1929 and 31. However, later he formed a national government with the Conservatives and Liberals and was actually expelled from the Labour Party. So hopefully Andy won't do that.
Yeah, it's worth for people who don't know outside of the UK, that relationship's been going for almost 100 years, well, actually slightly over
It's
100 years
over
now.
100, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting at the moment because Labour got about 400 MPs. There's about 40 Labour and cooperative MPs, so about a tenth of the parliamentary party. The number of Labour and cooperative councillors at local government level is actually slightly higher as a proportion. I think it's about 25% of local councillors are Labour and cooperative, although that's changed a bit since the May elections. So, but it's an interesting relationship, and as you say, it's slightly asymmetrical in that you can stand as a Labourer candidate to be an MP or a councillor. You can stand as a Labour and cooperative candidate, but you can't stand as a cooperative candidate, which is questionable.
So yeah, Andy Burnham, he's had a very, very long association with the co-op movement. And I know very early on in his career, he was part of a local football task force, and he was appointed by the as a government special advisor to the then Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. And he actually helped develop Supporters Direct. And this is a fantastic organisation which basically helped fans set up supporters trust as democratic co-ops. And throughout his career, he cited these and it's an example of how grassroots activity can really drive change. And that's something that he's been has really spoken about throughout his career, this idea of local mutual collective ownership. And he actually made some of this happen during his time as mayor of Greater Manchester. So, as mayor, he launched the Cooperative Commission in 2019, which was tasked with developing a policy for co-ops in the city region. And it culminated in a big report that called A Cooperative Greater Manchester, which set out a load of policy recommendations across housing, transport, digital, and business. And he remutualised or brought back into public ownership the bus system in Manchester, the B network. So, which is actually, so I live in Greater Manchester, and it's a great system. Bus prices have gone down and they're fairly regular, which is a very, very good thing. And he's got a very long-standing history with Rose Marley as well. So Rose is the chief executive of Cooperatives UK, and they work together at Greater Manchester. And she has recently been appointed the co-chair designate of a new mayoral development corporation in Middleton in Greater Manchester, which is trying to deliver cooperative community regeneration in the town. And that was announced as part of Burnham's 10-year vision in last July during the International Year of Cooperatives. So he has done a lot of things around cooperation, Colin.
Yeah, I was going back through issues of the magazine to look at what's been written about him, and this is a good plug, by the way, for getting a subscription if you haven't got one to the magazine, because I reckon there's about 100 articles over the last decade featuring Andy Burnham and cooperative developments in mostly in Greater Manchester, but some of the things he said in relation to cooperation and related issues, which I think are really important. I think one of the things that's disappointed me about what's happening at the moment is that most of the media and political analysis commentary is concentrated on the sort of psychodrama of who's in, who's out, who's up, who's down, all that sort of stuff, rather than policies. And what's interesting about Andy is if you go back over his history, he's been very consistent around a number of issues which relate to sort of cooperative themes, actual promotion of cooperatives, which you've already mentioned, but then also he's been very keen on pluralistic cooperation between political parties, So Greater Manchester, for those you don't know, has 10 local authorities which combine together into a Greater Manchester Combined Authority, which Andy is then the mayor of Greater Manchester, and he's played a very important role in bringing together people from different political parties across Greater Manchester for some of the initiatives, supporting some of the initiatives like the republicisation of the bus network, which is fantastically good. I can attest to that, by the way, because I used to live in Manchester and I remember when it was all privatised and buses were literally fighting each other down the street to pick up passengers. So he's been involved in a lot of that, and it's been very successful. He's been a long-term supporter of changing our electoral system in the UK to proportional representation, which would lead to inevitably to more political cooperation between political parties, because nobody would get a majority in most cases. And most importantly of all, which fits together with a lot of cooperative development, he's been supporting really radical devolution ideas to try and decentralise the British state, shift power out of Westminster and Whitehall down to localities a lot more, including control over local finances, which local government in the UK has very little control over. In most areas, it controls less than 20% of total public spending in the area. And that's way out of line with most European countries, for example.
The pluralism aspect is fascinating because I think there's definitely been anecdotally more conversations happening about cross-party politics, not just in the UK but internationally as well, and about the importance of if you want something to happen, you have to work with other people. And that is the basis of what cooperation is about. And recently there's been a number of cross-party events happening in Westminster and elsewhere. The most recent actually was well, it's the one an event to mark the 1 year of the Labour Party's Mutual and Cooperative Council, which is set up, sorry, committee that was set up by the Labour government to look at how to double the size of the co-op and mutual economy. And there was a Tory MP there who came and said, "Yes, I am a member of Waitrose," which got lots of chuckles. So for those who don't know, Waitrose is part of the John Lewis Partnership, which is technically a worker-owned cooperative. But it was a really interesting group of people in the room because there was an acknowledgement that there is not a two-party system anymore, or if it's a two-party system, the colours are changing, and that actually to make change, realistic change happen, you do have to extend the hand across the table, across the line, and listen to people and figure out how to make changes that impact people's real lives. And I feel like that is something that Andy has done. So it'll be interesting to see if and when he does mount a leadership challenge against current Prime Minister Keir Starmer, he does get into the top role in Downing Street, how much of this will translate into government policies.
Yeah, there's a very good article by Miles in the not the current issue, but the previous issue of the magazine about the change in political landscape in English local government as a result of the May local government elections, which essentially we've got in England a five-party system now instead of a two-party system, or two and a half as it was before. And he makes the point that there's all sorts of issues about how there can be cooperation across party lines, particularly around some of these local economic developments and local community development ideas. And there are people certainly in the Labour Party, in the Liberal Democrats, in the Green Party in England, and in the nationalist parties in Wales and Scotland, who are fairly avid cooperative supporters. And so one of the questions is how do you manage to get those people talking to each other across party lines around better cooperative and mutual developments? Yeah, I think it's going to be extremely interesting if Burnham becomes Prime Minister, given his cooperative track record. The current Labour government came in committed, as you said at the beginning, Rebecca, to doubling the size of the cooperative and mutual sector. It has to say that my personal interpretation of what they've done so far is fairly anemic. It's not, they've put some money in, but it's in the millions, not the billions. And it probably needs to be more in the billions. They're making some regulatory and other changes. I don't think they've put in some of the structural things that you need for a healthy cooperative mutual ecosystem to exist, including things like education and training for people who are going to manage in the cooperative sector. I was talking to somebody about that just this week. So I think there's a lot still to be done. It'll be challenging to see whether or not Burnham can actually steer Whitehall in that direction. Because one of the problems, I think, is there are very few people working in Whitehall, either politicians or, and particularly civil servants, who have any idea what the cooperative movement really is. So I think that's going to be one to watch and one that we will probably be covering in cooperative news, I suspect, over the next year or so.
I think we might do a couple of articles on it, Colin. I think you're right. Yep. I think another thing that's probably worth noting is that I'm very aware, we're talking from a UK perspective here, and coalitions and multi-party systems are not unusual elsewhere in Europe and elsewhere in the world. So I think this is
No.
this is fairly new territory for us. So please do bear with us. But I think it should be an interesting road ahead. I guess on the doubling the size of the economy, Colin, like one thing we should note is that last weekend it was UK Co-op Congress. And as actually announced there by Rachel Blake, who's economic secretary to the Treasury. Let me get that right. Who said that there is going to be a new cooperative champion for the sector. Now it's not a co-op minister. Hopefully that might come if Andy does become prime minister. But I think it is an interesting step because there was a press release from the government, and Blair McDougall, who's the Minister for Small Business and Economic Transformation, said, co-ops and mutuals have a vital role to play in our small business plan, rebuilding pride and place in the UK and supporting workers and communities. By appointing a champion, we will shed a light on this model, breaking down barriers to business and back our ambition to double the size of the sector. So this doubling is still used in political rhetoric, and hopefully with this champion, with Andy taking steps towards Downing Street, we might see some changes in this area.
I hope so. I'm a bit cynical about joined up government in central government. Government's been through a whole series of cycles of trying to get government departments to work together on what are called wicked issues, things which cut across departmental boundaries, and they've not been terribly successful. And I think Andy's experience in Greater Manchester will be incredibly valuable for that, because the real place you can join up services and regulation and provision and support is in localities. And that's why I think radical decentralization, devolution, whatever you want to call it, is going to be a key element to being able to make some of the changes that are necessary, and to decentralize the UK a bit and move wealth and power away from London and the southeast.
So I guess it's watch this space.
Yep.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Colin. Thanks everyone for listening. Have a lovely week and keep on cooperating.